Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ahmed Ibrahim. I am with the Computer Science Department at the University of Kentucky in the USA. Today, I'm going to present a new authentication protocol for an Authentication-as-a-Service cloud using Peterson Commitment Scheme. In this presentation, I will present a background on authentication. Then current authentication limitations and threats will be presented, as well as Peterson Commitment Scheme, which will be used in our protocol. After that, the proposed protocol for the Authentication-as-a-Service cloud will be discussed. Lastly will be the security analysis of the protocol and the conclusion. The first step in initiating communication between untrusted parties is to ensure and verify that each party is the one it's claiming to be, which is called authentication. Authentication is the concept of uniquely identifying individuals to provide assurance of the individual's user's identity. Public key infrastructure is an infrastructure that allows binding public keys with respective unique user identities as introduced by Diffie and Hellman. In PKI, each user has two keys, a public key and a private key. The private key is kept secret while the public key can be published for any user to see or to use. A public key infrastructure consists of a registration authority that acts as the verifier for the certificate authority before a digital signature is issued to a requester. A certificate authorization that issues and verifies digital certificates to bind identities with corresponding public keys. Digital certificates, which contain identity information for entities, a certificate repository database where the digital certificates are stored, and a checker that runs over these components to check the revocation status of issued digital certificates, and finally a certificate management system which provides the tools for the PKI to perform. Certificate authorities usually allow delegates or intermediate CAs to issue certificates as well, which results in what is called a chain of trust. Nowadays, clouds are being widely used to offer highly desired services to dispersed entities. For example, some new businesses rely on the cloud technology to minimize the cost of using their taxi service and even to reduce the time it takes to get a taxi. But insufficient authentication may decrease the safety of involved parties, causing serious incidents like sexual assault and armed robbery. Moreover, clouds are being used nowadays to enhance medical research, and it requires patients' involvement and share patients' health records across different healthcare providers. Thus, user authentication is very important in such environments. Digital signatures are vastly used in public key crypto systems to achieve authentication, integrity, and non-repudiation. The original concept was to encrypt the message using the sender's private key, which results in a digital signature, as long as the message, to be appended to the original message. As messages got longer, they had to be broken into blocks, and each block had to be digitally signed, which is very time-consuming. To remedy the complexity of signing the whole original message and to avoid the possibility of finding a forged message, hashing algorithms like MD5 and SHA-1 are used with asymmetric encryption algorithms. To create digital signatures, a message digest is generated and then encrypted with the sender's private key. The message and the signature are concatenated together to form the digital signature. To verify a digital signature, the original message is hashed, and the signature is decrypted using the signer's public key to retrieve the signed hash. If both hashes match, then the signature is considered valid. The security of this model depends only on the likelihood of finding a fake message that generates the same signature as the original message being signed. In addition, if a fake message which can generate the same signature was found, there would be almost no probability that the fake message could replace a meaningful valid message. SSL and TLS are secure protocols which implement digital signatures for authentication and symmetric encryption to protect communication. In mutual SSL-TLS authentication, both client and server authenticate each other through digital certificates, so that both parties are assured of the other's identity. The process of authentication and establishing an encrypted channel using certificate-based mutual authentication involves the following steps. First, a client requests access to a protected resource. The server replies with its certificate to the client. The client then verifies the server's certificate by contacting the issuing certificate authority, and if successful, the client sends its certificate to the server, which actually also checks and verifies the client's certificate by contacting the certificate authority, and if that yields that the certificate is valid, the server grants access to the protected resource requested by the client. Usually, communicating parties develop trust over time, according to their communication progress. You can trust a certificate only if you can trust the CA that issued it, and you can trust the CA only if you can trust a CA above it in the chain. This is called a chain of trust. The validated chain then implies the authenticity of all the certificates. However, PKI authentication is vulnerable when used for initial contact due to the chain of trust concept and a lack of prior trust and communication. Because a certificate hardly implies the level of trust in a party's identity, it's possible to have a suspicious intermediate CA which threatens a party's authenticity, and it's hard to establish trust for the public key and private key sets of geographically dispersed entities on intranets and the internet. Subsequently, it is hard to completely trust the relationship between users and the CA that certified their public key and to specify the relationship in their certificate. In 2009, Marlinspike created two tools called SSL Strip and SSL Sniff. They actually do not hack the SSL protocol itself, but the transition from non-encrypted to encrypted communications. They hijack the HTTP traffic on a network, watch for HTTP links and redirects, then map those links into a lookalike HTTP links or homograph similar HTTPS links. Marlinspike was able to make use of the previously mentioned chain of trust limitations and vulnerabilities by obtaining a valid digital certificate for a legitimate URL that he owns. Then he issued a new digital certificate to an internal URL which he called PayPal. He then used a fake PayPal link to send it to his victims. When the fake PayPal link is clicked, the browser searches the chain of CAs until it finds the trusted issuing CA, which validates, which actually validates Marlinspike's legitimate URL. The browser then considers the fake PayPal link valid and proceeds because it's certified under a legitimate URL. This allows any attacker to be a man in the middle who acts as the server for the client and acts as the client for the server, reading all data passing through. In 2005, it was shown that it's theoretically possible to find hash collisions in MD5 and other hash functions. This affects the way digital signatures are created, since hash functions map arbitrary size messages to a fixed size message digest. Attackers can find messages which yield the same hash value to replace original messages, shown in the red boxes on the screen, while keeping the signature valid. In 2007, Stevens and others were able to construct two digital certificates with different name fields, but they have identical digital signatures. In 2012, a malware called Flame was discovered, which was used for several years to attack Middle Eastern governments' computers running Microsoft Windows. Flame exploited the weaknesses in MD5 to fake a Microsoft digital signature in order to gather data files, remotely change settings on computers, take screenshots, and copy instant messaging chats. It's believed that Flame had been operating for 5 years before it was discovered. In 2014, MacHugh was able to come up with two PHP scripts, which have different behaviors but the same MD5 hash. He was also able afterwards to create a chosen prefix collision attack to come up with two totally different images, which have exactly the same MD5 hash. And a few weeks later, he was able to find a third image which has exactly the same MD5 hash. To achieve communication accountability over clouds when needed, an authentication mechanism is required which can operate in such an untrusted communication environment. Pure PKI authentication using digital signatures does not seem the right solution in this case. I mentioned earlier that we are proposing a new authentication protocol for an Authentication-as-a-Service cloud that uses a commitment scheme along with an existing PKI to achieve the required cloud authentication needs. I will start by giving a brief explanation about Peterson commitment scheme. A commitment scheme is a protocol that allows a party to generate a commitment to a secret message while keeping it hidden, with the ability to open the commitment and reveal the committed message later. A commitment scheme must hold two properties, binding and hiding. The binding property ensures that the committing party cannot change a commitment already made. The hiding property ensures that the commitment does not reveal any information about the committed secret message until desired. A commitment scheme typically has three phases: the phase during which shared variables are generated and distributed, the commit phase during which a committed value is chosen and specified, and the reveal phase during which the committed value is revealed and checked. To clarify how these phases work, we briefly discuss Peterson commitments, which is one of the most widely used schemes. In Peterson commitments, the setup phase is initiated by either participant to generate two large primes P and Q, such that Q divides P minus 1, a generator G of GQ, where GQ is the unique subgroup of ZP star, a function H, which raises a uniformly chosen value from ZQ to the power of G mod P, while H is not equal to 1. The values P, G, and H are then sent to the other participant, which is the receiver. In order to commit to a message, M, the committer chooses a value R element of ZQ at random and computes the commitment as shown. and sends it to the receiver. When the committer is required to reveal the message committed, the committer reveals the values M and R, which are used by the receiver to compute the commitment and compare it to the previously received commitment. If they match, then it's said that the pair M and R successfully opened the commitment CMT. Our proposed Authentication-as-a-Service cloud provides a platform to mutually authenticate communicating parties without prior trust to each other and without requiring digital certificates. Each entity is described as either a service requester or a service provider. As entities continue to use the IaaS cloud, they maintain good identity, reputation, and confidence in their credentials for future communication. The IaaS cloud consists of servers providing the authentication platform that allows entities to get the parameters required to establish communication, a database containing information about service requesters and service providers, and a log recording responses received from entities on whether the authentication process was successful or not. The authentication protocol includes 4 phases: registration, request, authentication, and reporting. For each entity to register with the Authentication-as-a-Service cloud, it generates a pair of asymmetric keys, a public key and a private key. The entity then submits the registration request to the IaaS cloud and provides the public key while keeping the corresponding private key secret. The cloud assigns the entity a unique identifier and stores the unique identifier and the public key corresponding to each identity in its database. The IaaS cloud then sends the entity an acknowledgement of registration. When a service requester chooses one service provider from the IaaS cloud's database, the authentication process is initiated by the IaaS cloud. For every authentication process, the IaaS cloud server runs the Peterson commitment scheme setup phase, which generates the public values P, G, and H, while Q and A are kept secret. The IaaS cloud creates a log record to store the service requester's intent to communicate with the service provider. It creates a reply message to be sent to the service requester, including the service provider's public key and the public values P, G, and H, and creates a notification message to be sent to the service provider, including the service requester's public key and the public information or public values P, G, and H. The IaaS cloud then sends a reply message to the service requester and a notification message to the service provider containing the public values and the public key of the corresponding party to be used for authentication. Now, the service requested has all the information required to start the authentication process, and the service provider has all the required information to start the authentication process. In the authentication phase, the service requester generates a nonce unique to this session and sends it to the service provider in order to prevent intruders from trying to replay messages in the future. The service requester encrypts the nonce using the service provider's public key to create C1 and sends C1 to the anticipated service provider. The service provider then decrypts C1 to retrieve the nonce, then generates a random value M. It then encrypts the concatenation of M and the received nonce using the service requester's public key to create C2 and sends C2 to the service requester. The server requester can now decrypt C2 to retrieve the generated M and the nonce, and it then can check the received nonce to see if it does not match the nonce sent earlier. The authentication stops, and SR, the service requester, reports a failure status to the cloud. Otherwise, the protocol proceeds. The service requester then generates a value R and uses the values P, H, and G received from the cloud earlier to construct a commitment CMT. It then sends the commitment to the service provider, indicating that it knows M- without revealing the value of M-. The service provider can now send M to the service requester to prove that the value of M is the same as what was sent to the service requester earlier. The service requester can check the received M to see if it does not match the M-. Then it can stop the authentication process and report a failure status to the cloud. Otherwise, the service requester reports a success status to the AAS cloud and sends R to the service provider to reveal the commitment CMT, which was sent to the service provider earlier. The service provider computes the commitment using the M it sent to the service requester and the R it received from the service requester. If the computed CMT matches the CMT received earlier from the service requester, the service provider reports a success status to the cloud and further communication can take place. Otherwise, the communication stops and the service provider reports a failure status to the cloud. When the cloud receives a status report, it edits the log record which was created to store the service requester's intent to communicate with the service provider during the request phase. If the mutual authentication was successful, the cloud amends a success status to the corresponding log entry after receiving the success status report from both parties. If only one party reports success and no report is received from the other party, partial success is recorded in the log record. And if any party reports a failure status, the log entry is amended with a failure status regardless of the status reported by the other party. Now we will see how the proposed work provides better security features for authentication over using SSL, TLS, and digital certificates. In our proposed protocol, parties have to interact with each other to ensure successful authentication. For each authentication request, the service requester must issue a nonce, decrypt a message using its private key in step 8, generate R, the random value R in step 10, and validate the other party in step 14 to successfully authenticate the service provider. On the other side, the service provider generates value M in step 5, uses the service requester's public key to send M, receives a commitment from the service requester to the sent values in step 12, and afterwards receives the value to reveal the commitment in step 15. The interaction between communicating parties using the proposed protocol ensures confidence in the identities of both parties involved in the authentication process. The proposed protocol ensures both parties hold the private key corresponding to the published public key at the time of authentication. The service requester authenticates the service provider in step 14 of the authentication phase. Because the value M concatenated with the received nonce was encrypted using the service requester's public key in step 6 of the authentication process, and if the message from the service provider to the service requester includes the original M, Then the service provider proves that it knows the value of M, which was sent earlier to the service requester. This allows the service requester to authenticate the identity of the service provider and ensures that the service provider holds the corresponding private key. The service provider authenticates the service requester in step 16 of the authentication phase. When the service provider sends C2s to the service requester, which is encrypted using SR's or the service requester's public key, the service provider assumes that the service requester will be able to successfully decrypt C2. The service requester does not send the value M to the service provider immediately. Instead, it sends a commitment CMT to the value M. After the service provider sends M to the service requester in step 13, the service requester sends the value R to reveal the commitment. If the computation using the R received in step 16 of the authentication phase matches the previously received CMT from the service requester, then the service provider validates that the value R successfully reveals the commitment CMT. This allows the service provider to authenticate the identity of the service requester and ensures that SR holds the corresponding private key. In our proposed protocol, authentication takes place instantaneously with no need to validate any CA credentials or any chains. The cloud generates the setup phase for each authentication process and distributes the values to the communicating parties, who uses these values interactively to authenticate each other. Our proposed protocol does not include or use any hashing techniques. Thus, there is no possibility that any future hash collision discoveries can affect its operation. A man-in-the-middle attack usually takes place during message exchange between the sender and the receiver. In our proposed protocol, it is prevented because an attacker cannot decrypt messages C1 and C2 and cannot receive any useful information from them and cannot construct a valid message that can replace either. In step 11 of the authentication phase, the commitment CMT reveals no information about the committed value according to the hiding property of the Peterson commitment scheme. And after the service provider receives the commitment CMT from the service requester, the committed value M and the value R are no longer useful pieces of information to an attacker. Thus, it does not matter if both values are sent unencrypted in step 13 and step 15 of the authentication phase. In order to prevent replay attacks, a nonce is generated by the service requester at the beginning of the authentication process. It's encrypted using the service provider's public key as shown in step 2 of the authentication phase and sent to the service provider. After the service provider receives the nonce, it's concatenated with the generated M and sent back to the service requester in step 6 of the authentication phase. When the service requester processes the incoming message containing the concatenation, it can ensure that the service provider was able to decrypt the previous message and retrieve the nonce, and that the incoming message is not a replayed message. Finally, it appears that there are no easy answers to the problems which exist when using SSL, TLS, and digital certificates. As an alternative, we developed a new protocol based on Peterson commitments for mutual authentication of parties with no prior trust, demanding communication through an Authentication-as-a-Service cloud. The Authentication-as-a-Service cloud runs the setup phase to generate and provide the public values, but does not get involved in the authentication process. The security analysis of the proposed protocol shows that it provides a more interactive and reliable way for mutual authentication over current methods that depend on SSL, TLS, and digital certificates. Also, the overhead of checking certificate validity and revocation lists is avoided, the binding and hiding properties of Peterson commitments make man-in-the-middle attacks nearly impossible, while replay attacks are prevented by using randomly generated nonces for every authentication request. Thank you very much for your time. Again, my name is Ahmed Ibrahim and this is my email. Please feel free to contact me if you have any questions. Have a good rest of your day.